Today, V's, W's, X's, or U's? What is it? Hello again, I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to his posts covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, my great pleasure to introduce you again to George Gammon. Hello, George.
Hello, Martin. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's great to have you back, and you and I have some really interesting conversations when we get together. And I need to pick your brains on what's happened to the US markets, right? The Nasdaq's all-time high, the S&P 500 is back up. Is it all over? Have we now come out the other side? Is it a V shape?
It's a three-ring circus, I think is what it is. And, it's funny you're talking about a W or a V or a U or an L. I even heard on Real Vision the other day, they said it might be a check mark recovery. So I don't know what a check mark is, but who knows? But what I do know is the stock market is just going up and up and up, and it's completely removed from the fundamentals of the economy. I just interviewed Jesse Felder today, who's brilliant to say the least, and he just makes so many fantastic arguments for the fundamentals just not even being in the mindset. It's not even given a thought anymore. It's really about just liquidity and algorithms and people detaching price from value. It's what's the Oscar Wilde, I believe, is the person who coined the phrase that the fool, it might not be this exactly, but it's the fool always knows the price, or the fool knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I don't think there has ever been a time, at least in the U.S. market, where that has been more true. I even go through my Twitter feed or try to spend time on Twitter just to get a feel for kind of the overall retail investor. And they honestly, they don't even pay. It's hard to even articulate. They don't pay any attention at all to the fundamentals of the or the business or the commodity that they're actually purchasing. Or, of course, usually it's an ETF. It's strictly, is the price going up? That's the only question they ever ask themselves. Is the price going up? And if anyone has watched one of my live streams or listened to some of my whiteboard videos where I go into my personal investment philosophy, you never ask that question until you get, that might be the 10th question you ask yourself. The first question you have to start with, is it cheap or is it expensive? And that's whether you're considering a specific stock, a commodity, gold, or the S&P 500. And if you can try to focus on that question over the long run, in my opinion, you're going to do well because you're starting from the right spot. But if you just get fixated on, is the price going up or down tomorrow? And if I think the price is going up, I'm going to bet on it. And the Fed's pumping all this liquidity into the market, and every single person I see on Twitter or Instagram is posting their P&L from the last week. All these people on their Robinhood accounts are posting, all this money they've made. And what they're doing now, Martin, is they're taking their stimulus checks and their unemployment checks they're getting from the government, and they're buying an airline ETF, or they're buying an oil ETF, which is the worst thing you could possibly do as far as USO. I don't know if you guys have anything comparable to that in Australia, but just for the viewers, if they're not familiar with it, the USO is an ETF that doesn't own the underlying asset. So they don't own oil. They just play the futures game. So if the futures, if the curve is in what they call contango, then when you have to roll those futures contracts over, you're always going to lose money. So there's always a negative carry with USO. You're literally guaranteed to lose money if you hold it long term. The only way you're going to make money is if there are these short-term spikes. But the retail people, they don't even understand that. They think that they're just buying a warehouse that's just stocked with barrels full of oil. And you see just such a huge disconnect. Another anecdotal piece of evidence, if you will, is one gal that I always follow on Twitter is absolutely phenomenal. I'm actually partnering with her in this new product that we're coming out with called Rebel Capitalist Pro research product. Her name is Lynn Alden, but I read her most recent report, and she was talking about this gentleman, and I can't recall the person's name, but he's got like 1 million followers or more on Twitter, and he's this person that was in the sports betting world, and since that's been pretty much shut down in the United States as far as sports, now he's all of a sudden a day trader. And he's been doing it for like a month or something like that. And he's betting just massive sums of money. And he's doing everything on like cruise lines or airliners. And he's just making a staggering amount of money. And he's posting all these things. I don't know if he's doing it on Twitter, or Instagram, or whatever. And he's sitting there saying, just tempting the trading gods, if you will, saying, look at this, I'm better than Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's lost his touch. He's selling the airlines. You got to buy the airlines. And then people will ask him about his rules of trading. And he'll say, number 1 rule is stocks always go up. Number 2 rule, never forget the first rule. And literally he's saying these things. And I'm just like, wow, if that's not a contrarian indicator, if that doesn't tell you or give you some perspective on where we are in the market, it completely blows my mind. And I'm someone, and I was extremely fortunate, before I even really got going as an entrepreneur, I studied blackjack extensively. And I never got that good or anything, but I would go count cards at the local casino. And it wasn't really to make money. It's just I knew from reading all the Market Wizards books that if I wanted to get into investing or trading, which at the time I thought I did, this is way back in probably, I don't know, 2001 or something like that. But I was reading all the Market Wizards books, and I found it curious that a lot of the guys started with blackjack. So that's what got me into it. And then I read Ed Thorpe's book, and I said, okay, well, I want to train my brain to eliminate emotion as much as possible from the decision-making process and understand how probabilities really should rule everything that you do. And so I would go there. I'd literally play for 8 hours a day, nonstop. And I would just bet the same $5 every single time, never up, never, because I didn't care about making money or losing money. I was just trying to train myself. And as a result of that, I did extremely well in business. And I don't think in fact, I can guarantee you I would not have done as well in business if I would not have started with blackjack. But now fast forward 20 years or so, and I see how these people are trading and how the retail investor, if you want to call them that, sees the market, and it's completely the opposite. It is absent of any probabilities whatsoever, and it's almost strictly based on a narrative by the dip, because the stock market always goes up, and emotion.
What can possibly go wrong? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the theory of the stock market always was that it is an indication of the future value based on the cash flows of those companies. In other words, if companies are going to do well in the future, then, the price should go up. The reverse is also true. And of course, if you look at it, the real economy,
that's out the window.
Yeah, exactly. The real economy says, now, actually, we're going to be in difficulty for some time because of COVID and other things. But no, that's completely different. And it really is down to volatility. It's down to the herd mentality. And it's about the dumb money, isn't it? Because essentially some of the smart investors are actually not playing the game. And I always remind people, for every trade buy, there's a trade sell. Right. So someone is actually selling into this momentum. So ask yourself why.
Yeah, exactly right. And some huge names are on the side right now. You look at Stan Druckenmiller. I think he just came out saying that he's never seen worse risk reward than in his entire career. And that's saying a lot. Than right now. You look at Warren Buffett's cash position. And I think it's at all-time highs or very close to all-time highs. So when you're asking me if I would rather be on the same side of the boat as Warren Buffett and Stan Druckenmiller, or this guy, these people on Robinhood, it's a very easy decision for me. And although I just was talking about probabilities and a lack of emotion and facts and data, I do occasionally really like to look at the psychology of it and kind of look at history. And it seems to me the market always hurts as many retail investors as possible. Like, it'll do just enough to lure them in to create maximum pain. Whether it's in the housing market, whether it's the stock market, you look at the 99, 2000, I'm sure the same thing maybe in 1929. But it just seems to be the retail average Joe and Jane is always going to receive the brunt of the punishment from the market. So if you can fade those people, I think you could have an edge there. And I remember even going back to gold, and I'm the biggest fan, or one of the biggest fans of gold there is. I always encourage people, and what I do is I like to keep 10% physical gold in the portfolio just as an insurance policy. But I remember back in, 2011 maybe, when it was up at, I think at 1900 it might have peaked out. And I was in Arizona at the time. I remember going to all the malls and seeing like every single kiosk or cart that you saw in the mall was "We buy gold, we buy gold, we buy gold." You'd sit there and turn on the TV, and every commercial you heard or saw was "We buy gold." Same thing on the radio. And you start and then all, your buddies that don't know anything about the market or macro, they're sitting there saying, "Oh my, what are you doing today?" "Well, are you kidding me? What's everyone else doing? I'm going down to the local pawn shop and I'm going to buy some gold coins." And you're like, okay, so this isn't a good sign. This is a sign of we're closer to the end, let's say, of a bull market than we are at the beginning. And it's the same thing in Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is very attractive from a speculative standpoint, but let's be honest, when Bitcoin was up at 18,000, I mean, the Uber driver is the classic scenario. Everybody was talking about Bitcoin. I think CNBC even had just a running ticker of the price instead of like the S&P. That's when you want to get out. And I started investing in 2012, and I've been very fortunate to do well. But I have had a couple investments that I've got my butt handed to me. And I've noticed every single time I've made an investment where every single person around me, friends and family, is telling me that I'm absolutely crazy. What are you doing, George? You're investing in Colombia, in real estate? You've got to be out of your mind. No one's going to go down there. You're going to get kidnapped. You're going to get decapitated. You're crazy to invest in apartments or whatever in Medellin, Colombia. Don't you know the only person down there is a drug dealer, blah, blah. This was back in 2015. And sure enough, those are always the investments that I make a killing. That's when I crush it, is when everyone is telling me that I'm insane. The investments that I do, where I tell them about it, and people are like, that's a great idea. How do I get into that? Those are the ones where I always lose a ton of money.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. If everyone zigs, you zag is often quite a good piece of advice. Now, talking about zigging and zagging, the Fed is only zigging at the moment, right? They're writing more and more stuff.
They've only zigged for the last 10 or 12 years, yeah.
And I don't know whether you saw, but one of the senior people basically admitted that they're going to continue this bond buying process for at least another 5 years, right? So this is going to be part of the furniture for the next generation, right?
For sure.
So how much debt is too much debt? Is that a question that's even worth asking? And How does this link back? Because I'm interested in PPP, right? And the real economy. Because it doesn't seem to me that much of this is actually hitting the real economy.
I think it is and it isn't.
Right.
I just did an interview with a really good friend of mine who has a YouTube channel. I'll give him a plug at The Uneducated Economist, and he's sensational. And he actually, I love talking to him because he works at a local lumberyard on the coast of Oregon. It's not a big Home Depot or chain. And he's actually the ordering manager as well. So he really is in the trenches for people spending money on home improvement and what prices are doing. And he was telling me that, I'm sure I'm going to get the dates wrong, but later, like the latter parts of February, where we just started to see, okay, COVID is going to be a big deal, or maybe that was early March, that the owner of the lumberyard came to the employees and said, listen, unfortunately, we might have to lay some people off. We might have to reduce hours. Just FYI, be prepared. But like 3-4 weeks later, after people started to get their stimulus checks, he said business was actually booming because all these people were in lockdown and they had nothing else better to do than paint their house or do a deck or something like that. So and then what happened was the supply was being restricted because all the lumber yards where they were getting their 2x4, let's call it, they were all shut down. So you had a lot less supply, but you had just as much, if not more, demand. And so you saw inflation, or at least in those prices, going up substantially. And I know a lot of Americans, and I don't know how it is in other countries, but a lot of Americans are actually making more now with the additional unemployment benefits than they were making at their jobs. So it creates this very very odd dynamic where the employers are actually competing with the government for their own employees. And part of and I don't know if it was PPP, it's probably a different one, Martin, I apologize. But the program that they had for small business lending specifically was stated that you had to hire your employees back, or you had to keep them employed, or else the money that you took from the government would turn into a loan instead of just a grant. So, of course, you've got all these employers that are saying, okay, sorry, guys, now it's time to come back. And it creates all this tension between the employees. They're saying, what are you doing bringing me back? I'm making more money right now staying at home and doing nothing or spending time with my family. And you're making me come back to work, take a pay cut, while at the same time exposing me to a potential health risk. So it's the government just completely distorting things. But as far as to answer your question specifically, I think those types of programs are definitely getting into the real economy. But the majority of the Fed's programs, but I think PPP's the CARES Act, so that would be a government program. And as you know, it's a lot easier for the government to spend money into the real economy, in other words, increase M2 and broad money supply, than it is for the Fed, who can really only, as of right now, who knows what it'll be in the future, but as of right now, can only create these bank reserves that we would consider base money. And a lot of people don't understand the difference. But as of right now, the Fed just really prints money, if you will, by creating these bank reserves and by buying assets from the primary dealer banks. And then it's up to the primary dealer banks to go ahead and create additional M2. Or what can happen as well is the government, of course, can spend the money. They can issue the treasuries, and then the primary dealer banks buy the treasuries real quick, and then bam, they just sell them to the Fed. It's basically just debt monetization. That's just a shell game, so they can pretend that they're not monetizing the debt, which just means that they're buying, they meaning the Fed, or printing bank reserves to just buy the treasuries directly from the government, so then they can spend the money into existence. So again, to answer your question, I think part of it is getting out there, at least the government component, but the majority of what the Fed's doing probably hasn't hit the real economy. as much. But that said, though, if you look at M2, the chart of M2 has gone parabolic, just like the chart of the Fed's balance sheet. So I don't know if that's just correlation or causation. Who knows? I guess we'll see here pretty soon.
Okay, so then the obvious next question is those unemployment numbers that came out last week, right? It was down to 13 something, right, rather than what it was. And then the Labour Department came out and said, well, actually, those numbers aren't quite right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I mean, I think the unemployment number is just as much of a joke as the CPI. And if you look at the way the CPI is calculated, and if you just calculated it the way the government did, not some tinfoil hat guy in his garage, but just using the government method they used in the 80s or the 90s, inflation would be, let's call it 5-6%, if not higher. But it's the exact same thing with unemployment. If they calculated unemployment, and I don't know, I can't recall the specific decade, but it wasn't that long ago. In fact, I think the big change they made was in 1994. And in fact, I know that because I looked at a chart the other day, and if you see the unemployment, and that's with U6 or U3, and U3 is the headline unemployment number, but both of those just dropped dramatically, like right after 1994. They go down by like 2 or 3 percentage points. That makes you think that, oh my gosh, the economy must have been booming at that time. Nah, it's just they finagled the numbers in the way that they calculate things. So my point is, if you look at unemployment since 1994, even in the last 20 years, and if you would have just calculated it the way they did prior to 1994, unemployment would be much higher today. And I think most people, just the average Joe and Jane on the street, they hear the word unemployment, and they just think that means it's the lump sum total of everyone without a job. And nothing could be further from the truth. Another interesting study I looked at that I'll probably use on my video tomorrow is looking at the way they measured unemployment during the Depression. And I was shocked to find this out. And I actually need to reread it again because I can't believe it's true. But they were saying that there was a couple different ways of measuring it. But the headline number that we see today that was up at 25%, that included government workers. So back then, they felt as though if you worked for the government, you were basically unemployed because you weren't producing anything. So the unemployed. So again, just to restate this, so everyone's following me, if you worked for the government, you were considered unemployed back in the Great Depression. So if you just less out that and you do all these things, you see that back in the Great Depression, it would have been, even when it was 23, 25 headline number, if we measured it the same way we did today, the unemployment would most likely be lower during the Great Depression than it actually is as we speak, around, what was it, 14, 15%, something like that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we have the exact same sort of problem in Australia. The headline number is nothing like the real number, right? And they've gone through that same process of being very carefully to exclude those who aren't actually looking for work actively, and those who are employed for an hour. No, they're all fully employed. So actually, I look at underemployment, right, which is essentially the people who actually want more work and can't get it, and that underemployment is way higher than it was.
So is that the delta between U3 and U6?
Pretty much, yeah. Pluses and minuses, but basically it says if there are people working part-time who want to work full-time, we need to know that. So it's basically hours worked is probably a better way to measure what's really going on. And hours worked is pretty bad down here as well. So, but yeah, you're right.
How do you calculate the people that want to work full-time, but are working like 2 or 3 part-time jobs and having the same hours work? Because that's really a problem in the United States. I don't know if that's a problem in Australia as well.
No, it is absolutely, yeah. In my survey, so I actually go through that in more detail in my surveys, and the number of people who have 2 or 3 or 4 part-time or gig type jobs to try and keep the hours up, to try and keep the income, is gone through the roof in the last 3 or 4 years. So that's a fundamental change in the way that the employment market works, certainly here, whereas people would used to have one job and that would be pretty much where they were. Now they have to bounce around from place to place to be able to get part-time work, and that degrading of employment is just nobody wants to talk about it, because it's a fundamental shift that's happened, and it's partly because of gig jobs and those sorts of things. But yeah, many people would love to be able to get a single job in a single location for full time, but no. Yeah, and they wouldn't be included in the unemployment numbers.
Yeah, see, and that's what makes me even more concerned about the structure of the economy and the stock market more specifically. And what I mean by that is, here in the United States, of course, we've got this big millennial generation. And I would argue, since they've come out of university or college, they've had a real rough time finding good quality jobs. So it's much harder for them to get ahead, to build wealth, to increase their purchasing power. Additionally, you now have social media. So when you and I were growing up, you could see kind of what was going on with your neighbors, but you couldn't see what was going on with a million other people across the world that are probably posting fake pictures of themselves with a rented Lamborghini or a bottle of champagne that 10 of their buddies had to go in on because they really can't afford. But every single one of them is taking turns taking pictures of the bottle like they bought it, something like that. So the person seeing that on social media thinks, oh my gosh, everyone else is rich. Everyone else is loaded. Everyone's driving around in a Lamborghini with all these beautiful women on boats in the Mediterranean, or something like that. While at the same time, they're really struggling to find a good quality job to go up the corporate ladder, or maybe they're really struggling to start a business because of regulation, or it's really hard to get a bank loan, what we were talking about in our earlier discussion. So you have this combination where if they're getting money from the government, they're looking at that saying, well, I don't want to pay down my debt. I mean, I don't want to invest in a business. I don't want to invest in my education, because the only way that I'm going to get ahead right now is doing the same thing I see all these people on Instagram. I've just got to buy the dip. I've got to go into risk assets, because the only way that I'm ever going to get ahead in my life is if I do it investing in the stock market. See? And that just brings more and more of these people that can't afford to lose any money into this whole, I don't want to call it a Ponzi scheme, but it brings them into this this whirlwind to where they can, and they most likely will, just get completely crushed. And it's just, and it's weird that there are all these things that are creating this kind of perfect storm in the appetite for risk from the retail side that we just didn't have 10 years, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I see that in my surveys too. The attitudes amongst some of the younger cohorts are really interesting. As you say, they often take bigger risks because that's the only thing that they can see in terms of trying to get ahead. But the other thing, of course, is they come into the working population with huge debts already, because many of them now already have university debt to start with, and they're also wired and trained to think that debt is good. So they actually will have the the credit cards, and they'll have the buy now pay later facilities already, right? So they're actually being trained to become good borrowing citizens, right? And what I keep saying to people is, understand the game you're playing here is a game that's being played out for you. You are the cannon fodder, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You are the cannon fodder. You are the cannon fodder whether you're actually going and speculating on the markets, or whether you actually go and take those loans and pay those high interest rates. Because essentially, the way that the commercial world has been structured, it effectively is sucking the blood out of those younger generations. And most of them don't get it.
No, they don't. They really can't differentiate between productive debt and consumption and consumer debt. But, thinking through what I was just saying about the stock market, and that's being kind of American centric, but I would bet that the same thing is happening in Australia with the real estate market. So you have the younger generation that sees the only way to build wealth and get ahead is to dump every single thing they can and to leverage themselves to the hilt by buying a property.
And the government say, hey, and we'll give you, $25,000 here or $40,000 there to encourage you and to enable you to go buy that property, right? Again, you're playing the game as the cards are being dealt by those who actually are, needing that cannon fodder. And I keep saying to people, understand the way things are working, right? And it may be great to own a property, but if you actually are in the situation where you've ended up with so much debt and then you lose your job or you lose hours, as we're finding now, a lot of people saying, oh, this is really bad now. 38% of households in mortgage stress, according to my latest numbers. That's the highest it's been pretty much forever. People are getting caught, and it's because of the fact that essentially they have not thought through, I think, carefully enough, the implications of how things are actually structured.
Yeah, that's right. And going back to Blackjack as well, they don't understand asymmetry. And when you're investing or when you're speculating, you want asymmetry, meaning you want very low downside and you want maximum upside. But they're doing the complete opposite. Well, they've got great asymmetry, but it's just the wrong way. and they're making a bet or an investment, a speculation, where honestly, if you ask someone, a young person right now, what do you think your maximum upside is with this property that you're buying right now in Australia over the next 2 years? And I think they say maybe 5%, maybe 10% if they're incredibly optimistic. But they don't even think through the downside and then think through the probabilities of the upside happening and then the downside. So if your upside is 10%, and you look at a historic chart, let's say, or any of your data, I'm sure, would show that their downside could be 50, 60, 70% if it goes against them. And then you say, okay, well, what's the probability of it going up by 10%? And they say, well, Martin, I understand your argument. I think the probability is at least, we'll call it 70% that it goes up by 10. Well, okay, that means there's 30% chance that Martin's right, and it goes down by, let's call it 50, 60%. Think about what you're doing. You've got a 70% chance for a 10% gain, and you've got a 30% chance for a 70% loss. I mean, what are you doing? That's the, as Jim Rogers says, that is the quick way to the poorhouse right there. And it's the exact same thing with the stock market. A lot of the feedback I get is, yeah, George, you and Martin, you're bearish on the stock market or the Aussie real estate market. But listen, if I would have listened to you 5 years ago, then I wouldn't have made all these gains. But what they're not understanding, again, they're trying to play the game of price. They're trying to figure out if the price is going up, if the price is going down, instead of just asking themselves, is it cheap? So if you ask yourself 5 years ago or now, if the Australian housing market is cheap, no, absolutely nothing about it is cheap. And it's the exact same thing right now with the U.S. stock market. And yes, you miss out on short-term gains. But if you continue to use the strategy and the probabilities, it's just simply buy low and sell high. If you continue to do that over the long term, you're going to end up a winner, especially if you've got the correct type of asymmetry there. And my quick rebuttal, when people respond that way, I go straight back to Blackjack again. And for any of your viewers, hopefully they've played Blackjack before, but the objective is to get 21 without going over, right? So if you have a 19, you almost always, well, you do always want to stay on a 19. You don't want to hit a 19 because you've got an incredible risk of going over 21 and going bust. So I always use the example of someone sitting at, you're sitting right next to them at the Blackjack table and they get a 19 and they're like, you know what, I think I'm going to hit. I feel lucky. And you'd be like, no, you don't want to hit. Trust me, you don't want to hit on that. Just stay. And they're like, no, I've had a few drinks. I feel lucky. And then they hit, and sure enough, they get a 2. And they get blackjack. So the question becomes, did they do the right thing or the wrong thing? See, I would argue that even though they got the blackjack, they still did the wrong thing. Because if they continue to do that over time, obviously they're going to go bust. But if they would have taken the 19, and even if they would have lost that hand, because they did the correct thing based on the probabilities that over the long run, they're going to come out ahead. And do you really want to do we really care about what our P&L looks like or what our net worth looks like tomorrow or the next day? Or do we really care about what it looks like in 10 years?
I agree with that absolutely, George. Longer term, and by the way, one of the reasons why when I talk about prices, is go through scenarios. There's a 10% chance that it could go up. There's a 40% chance it could fall. That's the way I think about it, right? Because that then tells me where the middle risk is, and then you can make some decisions, right? But actually, when you talk to people, they say, "Oh, prices always go up." If I get in today, it's a slam dunk. I'm going to make more tomorrow. No, not necessarily, right? And as you say, 10 years later, it could be different. And the final point on that, if you've saved that 5% deposit for a property, and then you get a 95% mortgage, right?
Yeah.
And prices drop 5%, you're blown away.
Done.
Right? And people don't seem to get that, right? The bank wins, you don't win.
Yeah, that's right. All the bank owns all the equity. Yeah. You don't own any of it. And another thing too, I'd be curious about Australia is I don't know how hard it is for people to walk away from a mortgage.
Full recourse. Right?
Jeez.
Full recourse. So, in other words, even if you sell the property and you've still got debt, you've still got the debt, right? You can't walk away from
it. And there's no way to get rid of that in bankruptcy?
Other than bankruptcy.
Oh, you'd have to file bankruptcy.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. Geez, it's just, it's just the amount of risk that people are taking relative to the return. Just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Another thing that's very bizarre when I look at things from a psychological standpoint, one of the great things about Twitter is you can just throw stuff out there and see how people are responding to it. And you never would have gotten that feedback because as well as I do, you just kind of, obviously wrongly, but you kind of think that everybody thinks the same way you do. And you're just everyone's got to see this. It just makes sense, right? But you tend to realize when you go out in the Twitter universe that not everybody sees things the exact same way you do. And what's really amazing to me is how difficult it is for people to differentiate an opinion on let's just go back to price, an opinion on a price, and then whether or not to pull the trigger on buying or selling. So as an example, back in obviously I'm quite bearish on the United States stock market, which means I think it's incredibly expensive. And I've done several videos, back even when I started my YouTube channel 8 months ago or whatever, I was still doing videos on how, listen, the market's way overpriced. Look at the Buffett indicator, look at the CAPE ratio, look at all these things. But back in March, I went in there and there were a few things that were cheap. So I went ahead and made some purchases, such as like oil stocks, as an example. I don't know that oil is ever going to get cheaper than negative $40 a barrel. So it might be a good time to buy an oil stock right around there, But a couple other things, uranium, and then the cruise liner, a couple of these, stocks here and there. But I was doing videos on, hey, listen, I'm doing this watch list on things that I might pull the trigger on, even though I think the market is still going to go down. I'm still very bearish on the market. And people, they can't compartmentalize that. Like they're like, okay, well, why would you buy something if you think the market's going to continue to go down? And I keep saying, because I'm not buying it because I think it's going to go up or down. I'm just buying it because it's cheap right now. And it could get cheaper. You're absolutely right. It very well could get cheaper, but I don't care because I'm going to hang on to it for 10 years. So I can have an opinion on the market, and I can even have an opinion on that particular stock that it's going to go down, and I can still buy it because, based on oil is a great example of that. If you look at a chart of oil going back to 1950, 1940, you adjust it for inflation, there's very few times when it's gotten under 20 a barrel. And when it has, you see kind of a rebound there. And I'm not saying it's going to 100 or anything like that, but history has shown us that the probability is high that if you can buy something related to oil under 20, when it's at under $20 a barrel, you might have some upside there, right? Now, at that time, I thought oil might even go lower. I was thinking maybe $15 a barrel, but that doesn't matter. That's you see the difference there, and it's just really wild that so many people have a hard time separating the two. But it just goes to show you that we as human beings are hardwired to make really bad decisions when it comes to investing. We just are. It's just, when you look at greed, you look at fear, you look at all of these emotions that drive people's decision-making process in investing or speculating, and it just completely overwhelms them. And that's another reason why I think the market will always hurt the most retail investors as possible.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, absolutely. And interestingly, on my channel, I get a few YouTube ads, running, and it's quite often I've got these very, very bullish real estate people who come on in my YouTube ads, right?
Really?
Yeah, it's really hilarious because when you actually listen to them, you listen to them and they're just playing the emotion, right? There's no fundamental logic behind what they're saying, and people though get caught up in that emotion and get caught up with that very narrow viewpoint and then don't do the work and don't understand. And that is actually where, frankly, the fools make their decisions, and that's the problem. So I agree, there's a psychology and a philosophical base here, which people don't get. If they did, they would make very different decisions.
Yeah, another thing that's fascinating to me is you ask anyone in the United States, and I would assume it's the same in Australia, how much homework they did online before they purchased their last car. You say they spent 10, 20 grand on a car, even a cheaper car. How much homework weeks. They're sitting there picking out the engine and the color and, do we want white interior? Do we want a Tesla? Do we want this? Do we want that? What model Tesla do we want? Let me do all the homework. Let me research. Let me go on Auto Trader, eBay. Let me see what the prices are. If I go to the local dealership, I want to make sure I'm not getting ripped off, and I want to try to buy things when they're cheap. to use that again. And they can see, they do things so well when it comes to making a purchase, like an automobile. But when it comes to investing their entire life savings into in the United States, 401k and into stocks, they don't even do an hour of homework. They're just whatever. Just my financial advisor will take care of it. No, just throw it into a few ETFs and a couple bonds, maybe the S&P. Anyway, I want to get back to my beer and my Monday Night Football and researching my next vehicle. It's unbelievable.
Well, we say exactly the same here. We have statutory superannuation, right? So people have to put 9%. It goes in out of their salary. No argument. Just have to do it, right? But almost nobody is fully understanding where that money's going, how it's being invested, and what the structure of those investments are. It's like, superannuation, I can't be bothered, And yet that's probably one of the biggest investments. And then you can put the same on housing, right? They're the two biggest investments. You probably do the least research on those two things and spend less time really getting to understand it, right? Because I always say when you buy real estate, go local. Get to understand the local situation and the local prices. Don't just rely on the estate agent, right? I mean, people just, it's really weird, as you say, you spend a lot more time on unimportant things. But, again, it goes back to psychology and, and the way that people are wired. And I think that probably is the fundamental issue, And I guess the message for the day is stop and think, right? Ask yourself the next question and the next question before you go make those big decisions, because quite often people are making decisions on the wrong basis.
Yeah, that's right. And always remember what Hazlitt said in his book Economics in One Lesson. It's always about the unseen, not just the seen. We make decisions on what we see, but you've got to ask yourself, what's behind the curtain? What am I not seeing? What's not happening as a result of these resources being allocated over here when they could be allocated over there?
That's right. It's the unknown unknowns, I think, remember?
Yeah, exactly.
George, I really appreciate your time today. That's been fantastic. If people want to know more about your channel, where do they go?
They can go to the YouTube channel. It's just my name. George is the first name, typical spelling, last name Gammon. They can go to georgegammon.com, or they can go to Twitter. My name again. Easy to remember.
George, I appreciate your time today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Again, we must do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Martin.
Cheers.